message that Jordan White brought last week. I spent time watching it on YouTube. And in his message, he actually posed one of the most challenging questions of all of our faith. How can there be a God? The other side to that question for those like me with philosophical tendencies is how can there not be a God? I am sure for all of us, there are moments when we have found ourselves asking both of these questions. We ask them in our victories and our defeats. We ask them in moments of great joy and in moments of grief. And in these two questions, we must realize that these two really extreme questions are really where our faith should continue to reside. How can there be a God? How can there not be a God? The disciples were living in between these same type of questions as they had just seen Jesus ascend into heaven. They were wondering, how can there be a God if Jesus has now left us again? But then, as we know the Pentecost story, God responds in a way that asks the opposite question: how can there not be a God? That is what God can do. God can take the deepest questions and emotions that haunt us and turn them around to remind us that God is alive, God is moving, and the Spirit is among us and through us and beyond us. And so we must allow ourselves to remember that doubt is an important part of our faith. Doubt of self, doubt of God, and doubt of others are necessary feelings to find God's real Spirit moving. Because with doubt, the moment we begin to doubt something, it's the moment we begin to ask the tough questions. And with the tough questions, as we have done in this church, come difficult and tough conversations and encounters. But those type of tough encounters and moments allow us to stay open and vulnerable to failure. They allow us to truly come as the humble, sinful human beings that we can be, who need to know an ever-present God, whose Spirit is big enough to encounter all types of hardships. The story of Pentecost that we will look at this week and next week, like many biblical stories, lives in between these extreme emotions and questions. On Mother's Day a few weeks ago, we heard the monologue from Mary about the feeling of loss as once again her son ascended. Last week, you heard Jordan speak of his own personal loss. He lost the ability to become camp president. When I was Jordan's age, I also lost the ability to be camp president. In fact, I was never one of the top youth leaders for the region. I was liked, but I wasn't really popular enough to be the winner. And I just never seemed to quite win at the things I cared about most. And when that happens in your teenage years, as most of you know, those things really scar you in some ways. When you lose out to things that matter and are important, those things break your heart. And I remember being like Jordan. I remember my heart being broken. It felt like the church had an in-group and an out-group. And I was mostly out. And yet in those same places, I learned that God did not think that way of me. In fact, God doesn't think that way of anybody. God is about having in-groups. And so as I look back now at those stories that broke my heart, and as I'm sure sometimes you've gone back and looked at those stories of when you were younger that really challenged you in life, you still have found a way through those stories and through those tough moments to sit here in this church, because at some point between the ins and the outs and the populars and unpopulars, you figured out that deep inside you, no matter what other people are saying or doing, that God loves you. God can love you beyond the brokenness. And Pentecost reminds us that God can not only love us through the brokenness and the difficult moments and the great losses, but God can even use those moments to strengthen us. And strengthen us not for what becomes easier times, but what can become more beautiful and God-filled moments of life. From those moments of brokenness, we start to move into Pentecost lives. Lives where we recognize and look for the Spirit of God to move us. And yet we know there are people who get defeated. There are people who in these moments stay down and walk away. And then there are people of faith. People like Jordan who get defeated but will not stay down. His defeats, if you know Jordan at all, every time he gets defeated, it puts this crazy fire inside of him. It over-enhances his spirit and drive. It makes him find new ways to serve God. And even though he will never be camp president, he has been selected as one of the top disciple college students for the country. His work on the hashtag #WeAreOne campaign that he started in Kentucky is now recognized by the office of our general minister and president. He is engaged as the youth and young adult representative for the Kentucky Council of Churches. And he is just 19 years old, maybe 20. But he has continued to choose to focus on God and God's work. He is willing to look beyond the in-groups and the out-groups and live in the commotion and engage in God's work as the communion group, where all are called to find ways to serve and lead. Let us remember that Pentecost stories are not neat and tidy. They are life stories. They are filled with much chaos. They are the stories that can break us, and they are the stories that can invigorate us and empower us. And when we let them be the latter, they are the Pentecost stories that truly let us know that God's Spirit is a Spirit that will move us forward if we're willing to recognize it within the chaos and the community, and even celebrate that God's love is here for us and moving. And so I know that Jordan actually watches these on YouTube and on Facebook Live. And so when you hear this, Jordan, I want to tell you congratulations. Welcome, welcome, Jordan, to the Teenage Rejection Club. It has motivated some people I know to be the best faith leaders for their entire lives. Because all of a sudden that bit of rejection early on in life empowered a fiery spirit inside them. It continued to move them to Pentecost moments that were able to find joy in the chaos and even in the defeat of life. Congratulations, Jordan. Your Pentecost moment will bring you back again and again, as the story does of Pentecost, to the waters of baptism and the communion table. Your rejection club allowance will allow you to fail again and again, also in ways that remind all of us that God is the one who is still guiding us. God is really the only one who can work within the crazy situations around us. and that God has given us a fiery spirit rooted deep within God's great love. As we move to a new section on the liturgical year slowly, let us remember that the Easter season is about resurrection. And the resurrection is what Jesus has done for us and humanity. But the Pentecost story is about what God and Jesus have enabled us as humans to do. And so the question for you that starts this week is, are you living a Pentecost story? What is your Pentecost story? And if you don't know, then start to think about the places in your life where you are wondering, how can there be a God? Because it's at this question where your Pentecost stories begin. Those are the places that define your faith. Those are the places where you have a choice to find the fire in the midst of chaos and to seek out the spirit of a living and moving God and to teach yourself that the life-giving response for all of life is, how can there not be a God? Because you will all of a sudden open yourself up to know that in those places and at those moments, God's Spirit has not ever disappointed. It is rained down like fire if we allow it to be what controls and leads us. God shows us in the Pentecost story that within the chaos, there's the ability to understand and listen to one another. In the Pentecost story, there is a connecting thread that is able to connect all of us. Within the spirit of the Pentecost story, we can be reminded how to be the community in all of its chaos that God has called us to be. With God's Spirit guiding us, we can hear one another. And in that moment, we have a sense of unity. Unity that comes from the Spirit, that knows the Son, and connects to God. Let us live our Pentecost stories. Because how can there not be a God if we do that?